One. Single I salute. My guest today is Gennady Stolyarov. He's the author of Death is Wrong. It's a children's book. He is also the chairman of the Transhumanist Party and a comrade against the fight against aging. Welcome, my brother.
Yes,
Um,
thank you, Maitreya, for having me on your show.
yes. Uh, how you doing today? This evening?
Well, I am definitely in a busy phase of the Transhumanist Party's activities leading up to the 2020 presidential election with Charlie Cam as our presidential candidate, Liz Parrish as our vice presidential candidate. I have been reaching out to various people online, encouraging them to write in our candidates in the many states that allow write in options. And of course, we know we're not going to win this election, but it is an opportunity to spread awareness of transhumanism, of life extension, of emerging technologies, and of the fact that politics can be engaged in a much more constructive way than the mainstream political parties have been doing recently.
Um, can you just give us a little background on how the Transhumanist Party was formed? How did you meet Zoltan Istvan? Yeah, just to start there, and you can also explain to the people um, what is the core values of the Transhumanist Party. I'll start there.
Absolutely. So the Transhumanist Party has three core ideals. The first core ideal is support for significant life extension through the progress of science and technology. The second core ideal is support for a rational society and culture built on reason, science, and secular values. So essentially, the opposite of what contemporary politics is. The third core ideal is support for the use of science, technology, and rational discourse to reduce and eliminate the existential risks facing humankind. And those three core ideals have motivated the work of the US Transhumanist Party ever since the beginning. As you alluded, Zoltan Istvan founded it in 2014, on October 7th, 2014. So we are a little more than 6 years old now. And
Wow.
Zoltan Istvan is a journalist. He is a political commentator. He wrote a book called The Transhumanist Wager. He has traveled the world. He invented the sport of volcano boarding, of all things. And then he decided to run this presidential campaign, quite an unconventional presidential campaign in which he retrofitted a 1978 RV and turned it into a coffin shaped bus, the Immortality bus. He traveled throughout the country. He visited you, Maitreya, as
Yes.
well. And you went to the Civil Rights Museum together. And then he visited Washington, D.C., and he posted the original Transhumanist Bill of Rights on the walls of the US Capitol building, very briefly. And this campaign brought a lot of media attention. It was intended to essentially raise the public profile of transhumanism and give people an understanding that efforts to lengthen human lifespans and reverse biological aging are being undertaken through science and technology, even right now. And he was hoping to galvanize support for these kinds of efforts. But ultimately, he decided that the Transhumanist Party needs to be more rooted within the transhumanist community. So he did not want to be the leader of that organization in perpetuity. He has run other campaigns since then. He has run a libertarian campaign for governor of California. He challenged Donald Trump
Yeah.
in the Republican primaries in 2020. But in November 2016, he asked me to become the next chairman of the US Transhumanist Party because he knew my history of life extension advocacy. And he also knew that I had the organizational skills to take this party to the next level. And this is what I've been doing for almost the past 4 years. We have grown in membership to approximately 3,000 individuals at present. And of course, we have fielded some excellent candidates in Charlie Cam and Liz Parrish. They're both dedicated life extensionists, and they have been eloquent spokespeople for our cause.
How does one become a member of the Transhumanist Party?
It's very easy. You can go to transhumanist-party.org/membership. We have a page where there's an electronic sign-up form for membership, and it's free. It takes less than a minute to sign up. You put in your name, your email address, whether you agree with our core ideals, whether you're eligible to vote in the United States. And by the way, you can still become an allied member, even if you're not eligible to vote in the United States, as well as the state or other country in which you reside. So we have an international presence as well. We have a foreign ambassador program. We have many international guests on our virtual enlightenment salons. So wherever you live, the US Transhumanist Party welcomes you as long as you support our core ideals in a broad sense. Of course, we welcome people of different perspectives about how to achieve those core ideals. And we try to be a big tent for many different persuasions of individuals who might be worthwhile allies to our cause.
I have a question for you. How come you think mainstream politics fail people? What, like, and you know, I'm kind of a cynic too. I'm not even gonna lie, and I think I'm a little cynical because of where I'm from. But you know, I'm challenging myself to be less cynical because of people like yourself. You're such a stand-up person, very elegant person, and I've heard you talk at the Rad Fest. I've seen what you said, and a lot of the stuff you said made sense. Made a lot of sense. So just tell me, why do you think the political landscape is just it seems like it's so divisive, and it seems like it's not working?
Yes. And first of all, thank you for your high praise. I'm deeply honored to hear those words from you. But I agree, there is a lot of cause to be cynical about mainstream politics. And I think the reason that it is so divisive is because there is a certain opportunistic kind of politician who benefits from that divisiveness. So let's say a politician successfully manages to divide people into certain categories. And those categories may be based on circumstantial attributes. They might be based on gender or race or national origin, or they might be based on certain very simplistic beliefs like, are you for abortion or are you against abortion? Are you for gun control or are you against gun control? Then it makes it very easy for that politician and his or her consultants to target that particular demographic and say, you're from this kind of background, you have these kinds of views. Well, we can focus these kinds of ads on you. We can try to predict the behavior of this group that you belong to. And of course, the reality is each person is an individual, and that individual's perspectives are very nuanced. They're shaped by a lifetime of experience. And I don't think anybody in the United States agrees with the whole package of positions or policy ideas that the Democratic Party or the Republican Party are trying to sell. But they're trying to drive people farther apart. They're trying to essentially exploit these wedge issues so that people can neatly sort themselves into these political tribes for the benefit of the politicians and their consultants. And it is a strategy that ultimately works to the detriment of those who actually want to solve problems through the political process. Because if we solve problems through the political process, then all of a sudden those particular issues won't be there to exploit. So imagine if we had a society in which there was no gun violence, but also people could own firearms if they so chose. What if we had a society in which, let's say, there were artificial wombs, so there didn't need to be abortions, but women didn't need to carry a pregnancy to term if they so chose? Imagine we had a society where we actually solved the problems of racism or sexism what kinds of materials would be left for some of these politicians to campaign on. And I think it's because these people lack imagination. They
Right.
lack the ability to actually do something constructive, but they can point at a problem and say, aha, look, here's a problem. You should side with me because I say that this is a problem. And
Mm.
it is a very cynical approach on their part, but hopefully through the Transhumanist Party, through the kinds of advocacy that we've performed, we can show people that there's a better way.
Right. Um, what makes the Transhumanist Party unique from the rest of the parties that's up?
Well, the Transhumanist Party is unique in its emphasis on science and technology as a crucial area in which policy and politics can really maximize the capability of solving problems. So I mentioned, for instance, ectogenesis or artificial wombs as the solution to the abortion issue. Or what about youthful healthy life extension as the solution to the issue of Social Security being under strain, or the issue of healthcare costs, the vast majority of which befall people in old age. And this kind of creative application of science and technology is highly underemphasized by mainstream politicians. They like to talk about the crises of the day. If
Right.
something isn't very palpable, very immediate to their voters, they won't mention it, even though over a longer term time frame, even 5 years or 10 years, but beyond a single president's term, these technologies are going to have more of an impact than all of the controversies of the day put together. So the Transhumanist Party is also unique then in its long-term orientation. We don't just look at this election cycle. And indeed, a lot of the rhetoric of this election cycle, as well as every past election cycle, is just noise. It's intended to give some politician a momentary edge in the polls. We are looking toward the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the next 30 years, the next 100 years, and beyond. We're trying
Right.
to think systematically about the future of humanity and how that can be put onto the best possible trajectory.
Wow. Um, do you ever think that we're gonna get out of this two-party system situation that we're into? Because I think that's a major barrier to progress in this country. I do. I agree with you on that.
Yes, it is certainly a major barrier to progress, but I believe there are grounds for hope. First of
Right.
all, the American people are already thoroughly disillusioned with the two-party system, and the only reason why they are still enthralled to it isn't because they love the politicians within that system. It's because they don't feel like they have another viable option. They still feel compelled to vote for the lesser of two evils. And they, of course, get a lot of media pressure to that effect, as well as pressure from their peers who have bought into that narrative. But
Right.
what gives me hope is that people, I think, can only tolerate so much nonsense. And I
Right.
think certain politicians who cross the line into absolutely egregious behavior are going to be punished for it. And I think we're going to see that increasingly. We're going to see a kind of reaction among the American public that they're going to want more decency. They're going to want more respectable behavior. But
Yeah.
the Republican and Democratic parties are so entrenched in their malfeasance that they're going to find it difficult to change, to say the least. And that's when the American people are going to look for alternatives. So I believe we're going to have a record libertarian turnout this election. This will be one indicator. So Gary Johnson got about 4 million votes in the
Wow.
2016 election, and that was already a sign of major
Yeah,
discontentment
that
because
is. Wow. I didn't even know
those
that.
people Mhm.
Wow.
Those people who voted for Hillary Clinton mainly were voting against Donald Trump. Those people who voted
Right.
for Donald Trump mainly were voting against Hillary Clinton. And those were the two absolute worst candidates that the duopoly could nominate.
Right.
But I think this election, Joe Jorgensen is going to get more than 4 million votes. That is my prediction. And it is because people are even further fed up with the very slash and burn, scorched earth types of tactics that both political parties have been utilizing. But in the longer term, I think what will happen is both parties will implode because of internal scandals. And I can't tell you which one will implode sooner, but there will be a political vacuum formed as a result. And something needs to fill that vacuum. There's no guarantee what it will be, because in those types of situations, someone who seizes the moment, somebody who acts quickly enough and convinces people that they are a legitimate player, is going to have a significant edge. So my hope for the Transhumanist Party is to be ready for that moment and to become a prominent option for the American public to consider. And I think we're getting there, but we definitely need more members. We need more infrastructure built up. We need more successes behind our belt. We need projects where we're influencing the direction of politics, even if we can't yet win elections. And then people will see this is a formidable up and coming organization that looks at politics differently in a more hopeful way. And I do believe we have inspired a decent number of people already. If we inspire 2 orders of magnitude more people, then we're going to start seeing some major transformations in our country as a result.
Wow. The electoral college, the last election, uh, uh, Clinton, she won, and she got the majority of the vote, but the electoral college voted Trump in. What do you feel like the electoral college is necessary in the political process, and if so, why?
The Transhumanist Party supports abolishing the Electoral College, and I'll explain why that is an important step. The Electoral College originally had a decent rationale behind it, and that rationale was essentially to be a deliberative body, because the founders did not trust just the popular vote, especially in the 18th century when information was so slow to spread. You didn't have telephones, telegraphs, TV, the internet. So people in one part of the country might not even know about a candidate from another part of the country. But these electors, they could come together and they would have all of the available information. And they also, according to the founders' views, would not be as swayed by demagogues. They wouldn't be as swayed by rumors. They wouldn't be as swayed by incendiary rhetoric. They could come together as a deliberative body and say, okay, here are the options. And some of these electors would have preferred certain candidates or represented certain candidates to begin with, but they could change their minds and they could actually be free to vote however they pleased. But unfortunately, over time, what happened was the states began to require the entirety of their delegation of electors to vote for whomever won the popular vote in that state. And as a result, it just turned out that certain states were disproportionately represented compared to others. So the more populous states, because they have the same number of senators, but larger numbers of representatives, they have a somewhat less proportional influence than the less populous states. However, the biggest problem with the Electoral College right now is that the electors aren't actually acting as any sort of deliberative body. There are a few so-called faithless electors who choose to vote for a different candidate each election cycle. But I actually believe those so-called faithless electors are the most faithful to the original premise of the Electoral College, but there aren't enough of them to make a viable difference and to elect a candidate who is actually decent for a change. So abolishing the Electoral College makes complete sense because, first of all, it will get rid of swing states. It will get rid of these highly contested recounts where one candidate might have a narrow edge and the other candidate doesn't recognize it, and this plunges the entire system into turmoil. But I happen to live in a swing state, which is Nevada, and I get tired of the barrage of misleading and divisive political advertising that gets sent my way every election cycle, because each of the two major parties' campaigns thinks they really need to sway the voters who are somewhere in the middle. And unfortunately, that results in some ugly tactics. Whereas if they had to focus their attention everywhere in the country at the same time, some people wouldn't be bearing the brunt of this anymore. And on the other hand, for instance, people in California right now, they know that their state is going to elect a Democrat, and their electors are going to vote for that Democrat. Someone in Alabama or Mississippi today know that their state is going to elect a Republican. And so that leads to cynicism, that leads to apathy, because people don't think their individual votes can actually even have a chance of influencing the outcome. And finally, the Electoral College is a very winner-take-all, first-past-the-post type of system. If your candidate wins 51% of the votes in a given state, they get the entirety of the delegation of electors from that state. It would be nice to have, at the very least, proportional representation, where, let's say, for every 5% of the vote that a candidate gets, there would be some proportion of that state's electors assigned to that candidate. Of course, it depends on the number of electors, but a pure popular vote with proportional representation in other branches of government, for instance, in Congress, would make a lot more sense as well, because then minor political parties would have the ability to represent their portion of the electorate. And there could be many other reforms associated with this. Ranked preference voting, for instance, which the Transhumanist Party does internally within its elections. So people don't have to vote for just one candidate. They can rank order all of the candidates. And then, yes, then they don't have to fall into this lesser evil trap, because they can say, okay, among the Republican and Democratic candidates, they might prefer the Republican or they might prefer the Democrat. So they could still rank the candidate they prefer ahead of the candidate they really dislike. But as their first choice, and maybe as their first few choices, they could rank the minor party candidates or the independent candidates whom they actually believe to represent their views, who are not just lesser evils, but genuine positive goods in their opinion.
Yeah, voting for the lesser evil is definitely a throwaway. You throwaway vote.
Absolutely.
Just don't not vote at all. If you, let me see. Oh, you know what I want to ask? So, life extension is really a big issue. It's a big issue in the Transhumanist Party. What are some of the things you're doing politically to push the life extension agenda, so people can, like, what's some of the policies that can help push the life extension agenda further?
Well, there are several policies that I think are extremely important. First of all is FDA reform. The Food and Drug Administration takes an extremely long time to approve drugs and medical treatments. An average approval timeframe is 10 to 15 years. And even now, there are significant efforts to accelerate those timeframes with regard to COVID-19 vaccines. And I think it's obviously justified to accelerate those timeframes, because people are dying essentially by the thousands every day. And yet, there's a lot of resistance within the bureaucracy and within a lot of the political class to these kinds of common sense reforms. But it's important to consider the patient perspective. It's important to consider that if someone has a terminal illness or a really damaging illness and they want to cure, their risk-benefit assessment may be different from that of somebody who is reviewing a particular treatment in the abstract. And it's true, science is a time-consuming and painstaking process, and a lot of experiments don't work out, and a lot of the evidence that comes in may be inconclusive in the sense that a treatment might work for some people, but not all.
Right.
But there comes a point, if someone is sufficiently unhealthy or sufficiently at risk, that they might decide to take that chance. And instead of being forced to wait, they should have that option. And there are other countries where the system is more rational. For instance, in Japan, it's possible for a treatment to pass phase 1 and phase 2 trials, so safety and efficacy within a small group. But for phase 3 trials, the large-scale efficacy trials, the creators of that treatment are allowed to mass produce it and make it available to the general public, and then collect data. And within a certain time window, they provide the data to the regulatory agency, and the information gets reviewed. And if there are issues, that product might be recalled. But in the meantime, people have the option to try it. People have the option to determine whether or not it works for them. And one of the policy planks of the US Transhumanist Party is actually to replace the current administration, the Food and Drug Administration, with a radical life extension administration. So that would still be a body that reviews potential treatments and therapies, but instead of the goal just being keeping unsafe and ineffective treatments out, it would work more on the proactionary principle rather than the precautionary principle. And it would actively try to accelerate the availability of treatments that extend human lifespans and cure diseases. So that's one aspect of the policies that we advocate. Another aspect is, of course, funding. And let me use this pandemic as an example. A lot of funding right now is going into vaccine research, or it's going into personal protective equipment for medical personnel. And I think these are very worthwhile efforts. But there's another aspect of this that I think much of the public is still overlooking. And that is the fact that aging is the number one risk factor for COVID-19, as well as for almost every other infectious disease. So if people could be rejuvenated, their risk of contracting COVID-19 would decline precipitously. And likewise, even the younger people who are most vulnerable to COVID-19 are those who have certain underlying conditions, which are essentially signs that the body is breaking down. Some of the same processes that are involved in senescence are involved in those kinds of pre-existing conditions. So anti-aging research is going to be an immense help in combating this pandemic, but more importantly, preventing future pandemics. This is why the US Transhumanist Party believes it's important to greatly increase the level of funding devoted to anti-aging research on the order of approximately $100 billion per year. And this can be done through a combination of private efforts and government funding. We support increased funding to the National Institute of Aging. That's an organization that has done some good basic research, but also private philanthropic organizations like the SENS Research Foundation are extremely important, because they bridge that gap between the basic research, which government and academia often engage in, and the immediate commercialization, which a lot of for-profit businesses are interested in. But there's this middle area that is sometimes, unfortunately, called the Valley of Death, because this is where there's a promising theoretical idea. It could, through a number of years and a number of experiments, be developed into a viable set of treatments, but it takes a very long time horizon in order to be sufficiently willing to actually go there and perform these experiments. So you're not going to earn profits next quarter from doing that. You could be putting in millions or tens of millions of dollars into a particular area of research, only to have it bear fruit, say, 10 years later. And that's the kind of investment that we're lacking right now. There's another area, too, which is entry into the medical profession. So the United States has a shortage of medical personnel right now because there are very stringent requirements that are generally imposed through the advocacy of the American Medical Association. So to be a doctor, for instance, you have to go to medical school, you have to have residency, you have to have fellowship. It's extremely expensive. By the
Yes, it
time
is.
you're earning any money, you're in your mid 30s, and you have heavy six-figure debt. That's the
Yes,
fate of a lot of doctors right now. And
sure
what
is.
that does is it kind of locks them into occupations where they need a lot of immediate revenue. Whereas, again, those more experimental research types of positions, they might not pay off for a long time. And if you
Yeah.
have a large debt
Wow.
burden, it's very difficult
Yeah.
to really consider having one of those jobs.
Yeah.
So we would like to have essentially more of a tiered system of medical qualifications where in order to practice in an area, one doesn't necessarily have to go through that entire rigorous education. They could master some part in which they would be specialized then, and that might enable them to work and to make contributions without incurring that heavy debt burden. And I think the US needs to train many more medical personnel in every area, but particularly with regard to pandemic response. We need to essentially create an army that it responds to the needs of patients on a daily basis. And again, these don't need to be full-fledged medical doctors. They
Right.
could be under the direction of medical doctors, and they could be put through the equivalent of a medical boot camp for a few months, and then they could be deployed to assist people who are struggling because of this novel coronavirus. And at the same time, they build their experience by working in the field. And after the pandemic is over, we don't cease to utilize them. We continue to train them in other areas of medicine, and I think they would be invaluable for performing research, including anti-aging research. And what's more, we support the massive construction of hospitals throughout the country, more than a doubling of the US hospital capacity right now. We want to get to the point where there is at least one hospital for every 50,000 in population for the new hospitals that are built. So we need about 6,666 hospitals to get there. But again, what is useful for that is it provides the surge capacity that is badly needed during the time of the pandemic. But after the pandemic subsides, these could be repurposed as research facilities, and we would have many more places for people to conduct research against aging.
Wow. What about experimental drugs? If somebody has a terminal illness and there's a experimental drug that the FDA didn't approve, I mean, how can is there any policy to get these experimental drugs? Because I feel like if you have a terminal illness and you need to get to, you want to try something new, I think that the FDA creates barriers for you to get that experimental drugs. I don't think it's right.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And what you're describing is called the right to try, and the US Transhumanist Party strongly supports the right to try. There have been some steps forward made during the past several years at the US federal level to enable the right to try to become more widespread. It's still associated with quite a bit of excessive bureaucracy, but also there's an issue right now that some health insurers, for instance, aren't willing to help their customers get access to these treatments. So it's a process that will need additional reform at the legislative and regulatory level, but also we need to change the culture within the medical industry and the health insurance industry to enable greater acceptance of this mindset that you described, where a terminal patient or a severely ill patient should have the right to try these experimental treatments.
What's your policy on police brutality?
So the US Transhumanist Party strongly opposes police brutality. We believe that the police should only be using violent force against people who pose an immediate threat of harm, either to the police officer or to surrounding members of the public. The unfortunate reality in the United States is that a lot of police are trained to resort to deadly force as an initial step, even before any sort of escalation. And even I've had a situation where I was peacefully exercising in the exercise center of an apartment complex, and I was a young man at the time, and I was the only one there. And the police came barging in, two police officers with guns drawn, because there was an automated alarm that was triggered that led them to believe someone had infiltrated the building. And I had to talk them down, but for about a minute, they were pointing guns at me while I explained to them that I lived there and I was just using the exercise equipment according to the rules. And that really taught me that it is a matter of how they're trained to respond to these situations. This is not the case in virtually any other country in the world. In many European countries, police don't even carry firearms by default. And in Japan, it's almost unheard of for a murder to happen. And yet the police do not brutalize people. And it's a matter of how they're trained, how their outlook of the civilian population is. I think the police need to get back to a protect and serve mentality rather than seeing ordinary people as the enemy. And of course, if we have these kinds of reforms, the greatest beneficiaries will be minority populations in the United States. So Black people, Hispanic people are disproportionately targeted by police, and that's very unfortunate. A lot of this comes from the war on drugs, which really escalated in the 1980s. And we support legalizing mild recreational drugs. People shouldn't be put in prison for marijuana possession or engaging in the marijuana business. And clearly, the police violence surrounding that has killed a lot more people than marijuana ever has or ever can. And I think another key component is how technology is used. So surveillance, the opposite of surveillance, is essentially the population monitoring the government officials. And there are some positive steps that have been taken in that direction, for instance, body cameras on police officers. But sometimes we have situations where the body camera footage mysteriously disappears or it's inaccessible for a long time, and that needs to stop. So there need to be structural reforms within police departments in order to facilitate greater accountability and independent review of their decisions. The police unions are very powerful in this country, and they have been able to enshrine in law certain protections which are unreasonable for police officers, the qualified immunity doctrine, for instance. And I think a lot of police officers should want those kinds of extreme protections to be repealed, because these are protections for the bad apples, essentially, the people who are going to be sadistic, who are going to engage in egregious behavior and tarnish the image of the other police officers who aren't like that. So if there's a more effective way of dealing with the people who are acting in really egregious ways, and then there are reforms to training, use of technology to improve accountability, I think the rate of police violence in the United States can decline to the levels we see in Europe or in Japan, for example. There's no reason why it shouldn't decline to those levels. Clearly, a lot of societies have figured out how to address these issues much more effectively.
Yeah, I agree. Mass incarceration in this country, I think the United States locks up more people than any of the other the other countries. Um, what do you say about mass incarceration? Because it's in the black community, um, we have a big problem with education, the pipeline to the prisons. We have an educational problem. We have a mass incarceration problem that we're trying to solve. Um, Another thing is, I think that at a certain time, they had civics in the school system and they took it out. So I don't think people understand political education. They don't understand the process. They don't know what the electoral college is for. They don't know how the system works. And I'm talking about like in the elementary school and high school, the civics was taken out of the just like the instruments was taken out of the school system. The education system, the civics was taken out the educational system. Another thing I see is why are the police in the school system?
Mhm.
Armed police in the school system, to me, is pretty strange to me. But what's the transhumanist stance on this?
Yes, and you're absolutely right. It's egregious to have police in the schools as a kind of preventive measure. It would seem to me any reasonable person would think the police should only be called if there's a deadly threat that is imminent.
Right.
But that's unfortunately not the case in many parts of the country today. But the US Transhumanist Party definitely supports significantly reducing the size of the incarcerated population in the United States. And the fact is, as we have mentioned already, a lot of these people are sitting in prison for nonviolent crimes, for
Right.
marijuana possession, or for some petty offenses. Really, if you steal a piece of pizza from a convenience store, should you be locked away for years?
Yeah.
Probably not. Now, I support the notion of some sort of restitution, and Murray Rothbard, who was a renowned libertarian theorist in the 20th century, formulated what he called the two teeth for a tooth rule of restitution. So
Mm.
if you do damage of a certain amount, you repay twice that amount. So let's say you steal a piece of pizza that is
Mm.
worth $2.50. Then you owe $5 to that store. You owe $5 to that store. You've been shown the consequences of your action, and then you're free to go.
Right.
But there have been people who have been locked away for years for those kinds of minor thefts, and that's
Mm.
completely absurd. That is disproportionate. With the school to prison pipeline that you mentioned,
Mm.
there's an incentive toward mass incarceration whenever there's a private prison industry, because that private prison industry
Right.
tries to essentially justify its existence. And so that private prison industry lobbies for exceptionally stringent or draconian laws. And I think the reason why schools are targeted is because there are a lot of young and immature people there who haven't learned how to control their impulses. So it's easier to essentially catch them committing some sort of infraction. And instead of correcting that behavior, instead of teaching them the right way, they are shuttled off into prisons where they learn even more deleterious habits.
Mm.
And that, I think, has created a situation where it's essentially an intergenerational problem
Mm.
where some people experience this treatment early on, and maybe they have children and their children don't grow up in the best circumstances because they don't have positive role models around them. And so their children also lapse into this kind of behavior. So ultimately, there need to be ways of addressing misbehavior that aren't police. So
Mm.
there need to be people who are skilled at conflict resolution. There need to be people who are able to address these minor infractions without the police being involved. Again, the police should be involved if there's a shooting, for instance,
Right.
or there's a hostage situation, or an organized crime ring. But if someone is misbehaving in a school, if there's a fight in the schoolyard, why should the police interfere? Couldn't
Right.
there be some, say, local school security guards who are sufficiently strong that they could break up the fight and then, okay, give detentions to
Right.
everyone involved? They'll learn their lesson. But why put the
Oh, I don't know what happened. Are you still there?
can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead. I hear you loud and
Yes,
clear.
I'm still there. Uh, were you able to hear my entire answer to your previous question?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Um, Let me ask you. So what technologies do you see in the future that may reverse the aging process?
So the technologies to reverse the aging process would have to address all seven main causes of aging-related damage as formulated by Aubrey de Grey within the SENS approach. And it's not going to be one specific treatment, it's going to be a combination of treatments. But treatments that are able, for instance, to clear out senescent cells that are damaging the cells around them, or break the protein crosslinks that form on the exteriors of cells, or repair the mutations to nuclear DNA as well as mitochondrial DNA to clear out the junk that is within cells that accumulates over time and that the lysosomes within the cells cannot digest. So there are some areas that are farther advanced than others. For instance, stem cell treatments are one area which is already making significant strides. Another area that I think will be extremely important is curing various kinds of cancer, because cancer arises from the nuclear DNA mutations, and those mutant cells sometimes have the ability to spread uncontrollably. So if that can be essentially targeted at the root, then one, a lot of the terrible deaths from cancer can be prevented, and two, that's one of the mechanisms of aging that could be averted. Now, in terms of what advances would need to happen, advances in biotechnology and nanotechnology would be helpful. Also, artificial intelligence to be able to essentially iterate through various possibilities for promising drugs and therapies to a greater extent than a human mind can do, because the AIs can perform computations orders of magnitude faster than humans, as long as they have the correct or reasonably accurate models to utilize. Gene therapies are an advancing area, and indeed, sometimes altering the genetics of the individual is going to be important for curing certain diseases, including hereditary genetic disorders, of course. And ultimately, I think there's going to be a kind of hybrid approach, partly biological, partly artificial augmentation. So at the same time as biotechnology is advancing, we're going to have better artificial hearts or other artificial organs. We're going to have 3D printing of organs, as an example. So people who go through diseases or catastrophic accidents and they suffer the loss of a body part, they may be able to more effectively get replacements instead of learning to do without. So that's another promising area. But I really believe from the convergence of these technologies, we're going to get opportunities for treatments and cures that we can't even quite conceive of yet, because we can think of these technologies acting in isolation. But when they combine, you're going to be able to have certain possibilities that are opened up that are even far more innovative than what we can come up with just talking about it in advance.
This is what I just feel. Let me just turn this down. I this is what makes the Transhumanist Party unique, is that they champion life extension and science and technology as a whole. And this is what I like about you guys. This is what I like about the platform of the Transhumanist Party. Um, I got some other questions though before we wrap it up. Oh, briefly describe the Transhumanist Party Bill of Rights. Let's
Yes.
discuss
So
that.
the Transhumanist Bill of Rights is now on its third and most extensive version. Zoltan Istvan wrote the original Transhumanist Bill of Rights back in 2015. We had a vote to greatly expand it in December 2016, and another vote to expand it and integrate it with the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in December 2018.
Oh, wow.
So the Transhumanist Bill of Rights is a forward-looking document that tries to articulate a framework of universal rights in the transhuman era, when humans are going to be getting the benefit of all of these technological advances and augmentations that would dramatically expand human potential. But there could also be other sentient entities, for instance, sentient artificial intelligences or uplifted animals, or we might come into contact with intelligent extraterrestrial life forms. And then the question arises, how do we treat all of these entities appropriately, respecting their prerogatives to use their reasoning, to use their self-determination in order to live their lives as they see fit? So the Transhumanist Bill of Rights, for example, upholds morphological freedom, or the right to privacy, or the right to freedom of speech, freedom of belief, freedom of assembly, a variety of freedoms that we right now would consider essential for human beings. But we need to also consider, how do we continue to expand and protect those freedoms as essentially what it means to be human becomes greatly expanded in scope. And of course, we want to avert a situation where there might be civil rights conflicts of the future, because some people might say, well, okay, let's give biological humans these rights, but not cyborgs, not genetically engineered humans, or not sentient artificial general intelligences. And that could create a situation where there would be severe conflicts. And we've seen, of course, with the various battles against slavery or battles for civil rights in the past, that when you have this kind of resistance in society, it becomes the source of a lot of tension, a lot of violence that we hope to avoid. We'd rather have these civil rights questions deliberated on in advance, and hopefully we can persuade people to agree to these rights and protections for sentient entities, so that when the technology arrives, when these kinds of more diverse beings become more prevalent, they are welcomed and they are empowered. They're not shunned. They're not restricted in harmful ways. And I think these are issues that already are becoming increasingly relevant. We have cyborgs in the world today. For instance, Neil Harbison. He is a cyborg. He has built an antenna into his forehead. He is colorblind, and that antenna enables him to hear colors, so that he can use another one of his senses to experience that aspect of the world. And unfortunately, he has suffered certain discrimination. For instance, he was unable for a while to get his passport photo accepted because the antenna is built into his forehead. And sometimes he has encountered harassment, or people tried to pull off the antenna. And that's just unacceptable behavior. I think humans need to learn to live with one another more harmoniously. They need to learn to appreciate the diversity in this world. And that's what the Transhumanist Bill of Rights tries to do. That is what it tries to prepare our species for, as this becomes increasingly important with the passage of time.
Wow, well, I think the Transhumanist Party is doing wonderful work, and I'm very interested in seeing the progress of it in the future. I have another question for you. I used to live in DC, and DC is like a second home to me, and they've been fighting for statehood for a long time. What is your view on that situation?
Well, Personally, I think it makes sense if there's a sufficiently large group of people within a territory
Right.
that have met the criteria for statehood. The Constitution of the United States offers a process for doing so, and there's no reason to deny the residents of the District of Columbia that prerogative. Indeed, throughout the history of the United States, many less populous territories became states for various reasons. And I would say the same for Puerto Rico or for Guam or for any other current US territory where, for whatever reason, the residents want statehood, and statehood offers certain benefits. For instance, right now, people in DC, they do have electoral votes because the capital of the country is located in DC. But people in Puerto Rico do not have electoral votes, even though they are US citizens. So they're effectively disenfranchised in US presidential elections. But again, I think to achieve that requires a shift in the mindset regarding American politics. There are too many people who are worried about, well, what will the admission of this territory as a state do in terms of essentially the balance of power, or how will it affect presidential elections? And I don't think that this should be a consideration. I think one needs to essentially follow a more principled approach. Is this the right thing to do? Right. Is this contemplated within the Constitution as the steps that would get followed if this group of people wants to be recognized for statehood? And it doesn't matter whether it would give an edge to Democrats or to Republicans or to whomever. It's just a matter of, as American citizens, do these people have this right to this kind of status?
Yeah, because I just thought it was hypocritical for them to be taxed, and they don't have a big say, and they can't vote directly for the presidency. I think that it's kind of hypocritical to me. Oh, tell us about your book, Death is Wrong. I love this book, by the way. Tell us about.
Oh, yes, indeed.
Yes.
So Death is Wrong is the world's first and thus far only illustrated children's book on indefinite human life extension. And of course, we as transhumanists, as adult transhumanists, have access to a lot of literature about longevity, about emerging technologies. We can learn about this field and come to appreciate it. But young kids don't have access to that. They don't yet, of course, have the sophistication to read books by Ray Kurzweil or Aubrey de Grey or David Pierce. But I wanted to give them a gateway, especially because kids learn about death when they're very young. I learned about death when I was 3 years old. And I kept asking my parents, well, what happens next in life? And they kept giving me the typical answers like, oh, you go to school and then you go to college and then you get married and then you have kids and then you retire and then you die. And I was just aghast because when I found out that death means you no longer exist, I was outraged because how is it that someone who hasn't done anything wrong would get the death penalty, essentially? And I know that a lot of kids are outraged and a lot of kids are upset when they first learn about death, but they're immediately met with these attempts at comforting rationalization, like either, oh, it's God's will and you'll go to heaven when you die, or there's some afterlife or reincarnation, or it's just natural, it's the cycle of life, it's the way things are, or it's far away, don't worry about it if you're a kid. But for me, none of those ever even remotely convinced me not to worry about death, because I just saw it as such an obvious travesty, as such an obvious injustice. And what I want to communicate to kids with this book is that this initial reaction is actually the correct one, especially now at this stage of human advancement, where we have the technology, we have the potential within a few decades to overcome this problem, to reach longevity escape velocity, if enough of humankind is committed to that. And hopefully the kids who read this book will get on board. They will become the next generation of advocates for indefinite longevity.
Yes.
Some of them will
Yes.
become scientists. Some of them will become technologists. Some of them will
Mm-hmm.
become philosophers. Some of them will be having the conversations that you and I are having, but hopefully in a world that is more advanced, farther along toward this goal.
Right.
And that is hopefully a set of developments that could make the difference between
Mm.
us reaching longevity escape velocity and us failing to reach it. I think getting the next generation to appreciate the importance of this endeavor is good for our own enlightened self-interest, because we want people in the next generation to help develop the treatments that will reverse our aging and that will protect us against disease and death.
Man, when I first became aware of the book and you mailed it to me, I said, "My gosh, I wish I had this book when I was 7 or 8." Because I remember the time I first was faced with uh, death, and it was the death of a family member, a very close family member, my grandmother. And I asked my mother, said, I didn't understand death. I was like, "Where is she? Is she in the hospital?" And you know, and it kept telling me, "Oh, she died." I was like, "So where did she go?" So there was nothing that I could read or anything, no material. And your parents is sometimes they have a protective nature. They don't want to tell you about the realities of life. But I think that this book is a very challenging one, and the kids, they can handle it. The children, they can handle it. They can read this book and be inspired to do something about it. And I'm an avid reader. I've been reading all my life, and the books that I've read changed my life and put me on the right path. If I didn't have books, I'd be in trouble. If I didn't read, I'd be in trouble. Because you're exposed to other people's ideas beyond yourself. So I really appreciate this book. And we have a library downstairs, a new library, and I still have a bunch of books that I kept aside. And I'm gonna, as soon as the library opens up downstairs, I'm gonna take like 20 books and I'm gonna give it to them. It's not open because of the pandemic, but yeah. Oh, another thing, you have an enlightenment salon. You have a YouTube channel called the Enlightenment Salon. Can you tell the people about that?
Yes, indeed. So the YouTube channel is my personal YouTube channel at youtube.com/G Stolyarov II. So the first letter of my first name, then my last name, then 2 I's for the second. And every Sunday, generally at 1 p.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Eastern time, we will stream a US Transhumanist Party virtual enlightenment salon where we invite one or more guests with expertise in certain areas to discuss with us the implications of their work for the broader society, for the advancement of science, technology, and culture, essentially how their work can help change and improve the world. And these are inspired by the original Enlightenment salons that were held in the 18th century during the Age of Enlightenment,
Right.
where people from a variety of backgrounds, sometimes eminent, highly accomplished individuals, were brought together to form these connections across disciplines so that people don't just get stuck within the narrow area of their specialty. They look at how their work affects life more broadly and how it can be used to improve life for as many people as possible. And we generally have wide-ranging discussions with the same individuals on a variety of topics. We have our audience in the YouTube chat that is able to ask questions, and then we'll field those questions for our guests. And these conversations, they'll sometimes last 2.5, 3 hours, sometimes longer. Sometimes we can't help but to continue the conversation if it's particularly engaging. And this just shows how much room there is in every area of human endeavor for expansion, for new applications, new ways to improve human well-being. So I would encourage everyone to tune into our virtual enlightenment salons, and they're all recorded. So you can see past enlightenment salons as well on my YouTube channel. Maitreya, you were a guest on one of our salons. which was great. And hopefully, we'll have many more guests in the weeks and months to come.
Can you repeat where they can find the Transhumanist Party on the internet? And
It is
also, if you can you tell the people about the two presidential candidates that the Transhumanist Party is endorsing, and how they can
yes, absolutely.
vote for those two candidates?
So for the Transhumanist Party website, go to transhumanist-party.org. And actually, there on the front page, you will find a lot of information about our two candidates, Charlie Pam and Liz Parrish or Elizabeth Parrish. And in order to vote for them, one would need to write them in. Now, most states will have a write in option. We actually have a color coded map on our website showing in which states you would be able to write them in and under what conditions. If you do write them in, we would encourage you to email us at US Transhumanist Party, spelled all together, at protonmail.com. And either just tell us that you wrote them in, or if your state allows you to take a picture of your ballot, and some states do, some states do not, but we have done some research on that, and we have a color-coded map showing that. Then send us an image of your ballot as well, because we're going to have an internal tabulation that will be able to show the world how many people voted for our candidates from various jurisdictions. That way, some states don't count write-in votes, even though they allow them, but we will count them. And therefore, we will make sure that your vote is counted, that it has an effect, that people will see the level of support for these candidates.
Wonderful. And after the elections, I'll definitely have you back so we can discuss more about politics and how people can get involved. And we got to be a little bit more or less cynical, and because we definitely can affect change if we all work together. I definitely share that view, and I'm so glad to have you. Thank you for taking the time out to talk to us. Um, Anything else you would like to say before we head out?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Maitreya, for having me on your show. This was a great conversation. These are the kinds of conversations that we need in order to reform our political system and reach a better world. I really do think we are on the cusp, potentially, of a better world if we can overcome all of the toxicity in the contemporary political system and the contemporary society. And with what has happened with COVID-19 and all of the secondary effects, it has felt like it has highlighted the divergence of the paths that humanity faces. So we can either accelerate upward toward this phenomenally brighter future, or we can degenerate into this infighting, chaos, disease, destruction. And it's up to people to choose. It's a matter of outlook and actions taken to reinforce that outlook. So I would encourage everyone in the audience, look up toward the future. Don't let people poison your minds with hatred. Don't let people convince you that the solution is to destroy. The solution is never to destroy, it's to create a better world.
I definitely agree, and I definitely support the Transhumanist Party and all of its endeavors. Thank you, Gennady. I see you after election.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Andrea.
Have a great night.
You do as well.
Thanks.